Hi and welcome to this lesson on global considerations. Now this is a huge topic and it's got so many parts you can explore, so it's a fascinating area. But I thought I'll start with a little story, maybe a little trivia question. Do you know that Australia is the only country in the world with long service leave? Now, many of you are too young to know what that is yet, but roughly what that equates to is that if you work for 10 years for a business, then you're entitled to 10 or 13 weeks leave paid for by the company for that period of time. Now, the question is, where did that come from? Well, it's actually an old tradition that went back to 1860, when it was about public servants being allowed to have time to go home back to England. Now, if you think of it, when the first fleet was travelling through, it took about 8 months for them to get here in terms of the fleet, travelling across and working its way down through the country. So all the way around here, sailing around here. By about 1860, you had a period of time when the country was growing and therefore you wanted more public servants to come to Australia. But there was such a long distance that people didn't want to do it. So the idea was that if you stayed for 10 years, then they would give you enough time to sail back to the motherland, so to speak, and back again to continue work. Now, by this point here, it was down to 4 months. Today, with advances in shipping, and you can get through the canal, through the Suez Canal here, you can get there in roughly about like sort of 5 weeks. So you can see over time, transport has greatly increased. Another aspect, you may want not, another piece of trivia, the route from London to Sydney used to be called the kangaroo route. Why? Well, roughly it would take you 12 days to get there because the plane would only go so far, although the total hours are only about 35 hours of flying, but it would only go so far and would jump across and would literally bounce its way to Australia. Project Sunrise, some of you may be aware of, is a Qantas initiative where they will be able to fly straight from Sydney to London in 19 hours. They bought the 12 Airbuses to do that as of 2022. So within the next year or two, you'll be able to fly there in 19 hours. Another expression, if you think about the old days of phone calls between places used to be an archaic experience. A phone call between London and New York for 3 minutes alone would cost you $245. An exorbitant amount of money. When I first came to Australia 20 years ago, my family, as the accent gives away, is from the UK. I used to do a phone call where I go like, "Hi, how you going?" And there's been this time frame of waiting for this pause for them to talk, and you might overlap it. So there was this huge problem with that. It's then become a better service. It's now FaceTime, where we can literally FaceTime them or WhatsApp them and have that conversation with a video as if they're around the corner. So communication between these places has increased. What is the message here? Well, global considerations are far more powerful for business than ever have been. For you transporting goods, you can now get goods from wherever you want in the world and they can arrive here, even by shipping, within a month. You can fly them here within 24 hours if you want fresh goods. Okay. If you're communicating, and you would know better than anyone else, then you can buy goods from anywhere in the world through an online service and relate to them and have those goods sent to you. So transport, business, production, operations of businesses have radically changed, and it's a much more globalized world. So in this topic, we're going to consider all of that and how it impacts operations. This lesson here will be about global considerations, about Unit 3, Area Status 3, and Operations Management. We're going to look within this lesson here at the global considerations for operations management, specifically looking at the global sourcing of inputs, overseas manufacture, and global outsourcing. Now, important to note here that the term considerations is used throughout the VCE Business Management Study Design. So you'll see it in corporate social responsibility considerations, global considerations, etc. So these are things we take into consideration when making business decisions. So this part here is going to be things we consider in relation to operations management. Our first consideration is the global sourcing of inputs. This is when a business acquires raw materials or resources from overseas suppliers. So from somewhere else in the globe, we're sourcing that input, that raw material, to be used in the business. So when would this occur? Well, one, if the raw material only comes from overseas. So if it was a certain product that couldn't be produced in Australia and it needed to be occurring from somewhere else, then you would be buying that from overseas. Secondly, it might be if the item is cheaper to source from overseas than it would be from here. So we're going to look at a great example. You know, one of my favorite things is chocolate. We're going to look at the chocolate market, and we're going to look at Cadbury's in particular and how they source their beans, their cocoa beans, from overseas. So if we take Cadbury as our case study example, Cadbury Chocolate Australia is manufactured in Hobart, Tasmania, and also in Ringwood, Victoria. The idea being that the cocoa beans are received in Hobart, created into a crumb, and then it is then fine-tuned into your lovely Easter bunnies and your chocolates in Ringwood, Victoria, for then distribution throughout Australia. However, cocoa beans, which is obviously the raw material for making chocolate, only grow in the tropics, so 20 degrees north and south of the equator in this band here. Now, as you can see, it does just about touch into Australia, but we don't have very good growing conditions for cocoa beans. So instead, they're sourced for other countries, whether it be the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Brazil, and Indonesia. And for Cadbury, nearly all of them are sourced from Ghana. So Ghana in here is where those cocoa beans are grown, and we need to get them to be delivered to Hobart for being manufactured and then across to Ringwood. So therefore, we have certain sourcing considerations. There's things we need to consider when we're getting our raw material from such a long distance away. Okay, first of all, if we're trying to work on just in time, we don't want to have any waste in terms of delivery operation. Think about the issues that are going to occur if our product is coming all that way. We've talked about shipping being roughly in the region of like sort of at least a month to get to certain locations. So if you've got a raw material which is ultimately perishable, like cocoa beans, we need to keep it in prime condition. We've got to be conscious that is it going to get damaged by salt spray from being shipped around? It's too heavy to send into air freight. So by shipping here, the time that's going to take. What happens if there's problems with the currents or the weather or the climate in getting it here and it gets damaged en route? What about how we store that item to make sure it arrives in perfect quality? So there's lots, again, of considerations we need to take into place on its route to getting here. We also need to consider where it's coming from. So how are the growing conditions? What happens in Ghana if there's a drought or if there's a natural disaster like flood or fires? There's too much moisture. There's not enough moisture. What happens if the quantity isn't sufficient? Or the quality gets damaged. And then we have to then think about, could the environment be damaged if it's not sustainable? What happens if Ghana chops down the natural rainforest to create our cocoa plantations? Is that good or bad? And how does that impact on our business? What are the morals and the ethics we need to consider as we're going through it? So you can see already there's lots of things to consider when sourcing your products from overseas, your raw materials. Another thing to consider are what are the local labour market conditions like? Are we paying the farmers a fair wage compared to ours? You may have heard of media coverage about certain industries having child labour. And how do we avoid that situation occurring? For Cadbury, they use what is called the Cocoa Life System. This is a program run by Cadbury's parent company, Mondelez. And the idea being is it touched on many aspects of life for communities in cocoa regions, farming techniques, supporting the local economy, and getting fair trade and fair prices for their farmers. So they invest in that. Another example is fair trade. You'll have seen that logo, I'm sure, on many chocolate bars or coffee bean packaging, which indicates that a fair price is being paid to the farmers that are sourcing those materials. So we need to consider that as well. Another thing to consider is what is going to happen to the price of the product. What happens if global exchange rates change? Imagine that we are paying 100,000 Ghanaian cedi for 100,000 tons of cocoa beans. Well, if the exchange rate in 2020 is 31 cents up here, then we're going to be paying 31,000 Australian dollars for that 100,000 tons of cocoa beans. However, as we can see here, by 2022, the exchange rate had fallen down to 14 cents. Therefore, for the same 100,000 tons of cocoa beans, we're now only paying 14,000. Now, in this scenario here, that's a great result. Imagine though if it flipped and it actually went up to that price. So you can see hopefully that exchange rates can have a huge bearing on the prices you pay for your commodities. And that's another thing you need to consider when sourcing your products from overseas. Another thing to consider are tariffs and quotas. I'll use this little example here in front of us. Imagine that we were making cars in Australia. That's a long time ago. Imagine though that a car was $25,000. Now along comes a Chinese car, which is worth $20,000. If I put that to you for the same type of car, which one would you prefer to buy? Well, I'm guessing you'd go with the cheaper option. That's going to meet the market needs. Now, the risk, therefore, is that everyone buys Chinese cars rather than Australian cars, and therefore the local manufacturing industry declines. So this is where tariffs and quotas come in. So a tariff is like, think of it like a force field that exists around the country. And the government puts a tax on any imported goods that come and break through that tariff. So let's pretend that this was a tax of 50% on the car. The $20,000 would have a 50% tax laid on, an extra $10,000. So now the car would come in at $30,000 to you as a consumer. Now your option is $25,000 or $30,000, and now you're going to hopefully pick the Australian car. So you can see how a tariff, a tax on imports, can deter the global sourcing of inputs or manufactured goods. So tariffs can have a role. Now, in terms of the tariff levels for cocoa beans for Cadbury, cocoa beans, if they're whole or broken, roasted or come in free. There is no tax on the import. However, if they were turned into cocoa powder in Ghana and added sugar or other sweet material, then it would have an additional 5% tax tariff placed on that. And you can see, therefore, the consideration for Cadbury is to buy this type of cocoa bean over this one to reduce its tax payments. So there's lots of things to consider when sourcing our goods from overseas, our raw materials, our inputs. The benefits, we can get materials that are not readily available in the domestic country. Cocoa beans aren't easily found in Australia. They are in Ghana, so it's great to source them from there. Equally, the cocoa beans from Ghana are generally of a higher quality than from our local country, and therefore that's going to add to the quality. In theory, they may also have cheaper materials overseas, either from cheaper labour rates or for cheaper production techniques, so that's going to be a benefit to the business. And it also allows a company like Cadbury to specialise more on the manufacturing or production of the chocolate bars rather than the actually farming and the sourcing the materials to begin with. So there's lots of strengths from sourcing our inputs from around the world. However, hopefully, as I've shown in that couple of little slides, there's a lot of things to consider as well that which could have a bad effect. Firstly, we may have longer delivery and supply times because the boats need to travel around and it's going to take over a month to get your supplies to the country. There's a risk of damage as the shipping distance increases. You're going to have to deal with overseas countries with different languages, and that might create language barriers in dealing with your suppliers. Their country's ethical, environmental or legal standards may be different to our own, and this may damage the reputation if we get associated with that. Equally, we might have to consider things like exchange rates, tariffs or quotas, which could be beneficial, but equally could damage the cost that we pay for items. So there's a lot to consider when we are having global considerations about inputs coming from overseas. Okay, our next consideration is in relation to overseas manufacture. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, that means producing goods or services in a country outside of our home country, Australia. Producing goods or services overseas. So going deeper into that, what is that about? Well, to do this properly, to manufacture, you're going to have to set up a manufacturing plant in an overseas country. So we're going to have a look in a minute about your Apple iPhone and how that gets produced outside of the host country, which was America, and is indeed produced in China. Now, the idea being with this overseas manufacture that you still have complete control of the operations, but may be able to access labour at a higher skill level or a lower cost than in the domestic country, whether it be Australia, or in this case I'm going to allude to, it's going to be America. Another consideration may be to locate manufacturing closer to the raw materials or to avoid tariff or quota barriers that we've mentioned beforehand. Okay, so there's lots of considerations about producing goods overseas for our business. One of the first considerations is the labour costs. Now, this is a very interesting graph here that shows the minimum wage levels around the world. Now, you may be very proud to see Australia right at the top here with the highest minimum wages in the world at this time frame. You may think that's a very good thing, and it is indeed for employees because they're going to get paid more than anywhere else. But if you're a business and you're trying to reduce your cost of production, then it's a big deterrent to actually producing goods within Australia because it's far more expensive to do so than, say, in Brazil or Russia, where it's at $1.24 or $1.04. So if you think of that per hour, per employee that you have, and you extrapolate that out to a big business like Coles or Qantas with like 25 or 30,000 workers, it's going to really add to the cost of your production. And that will inevitably flow on to the price of the product or service you're selling to consumers. So if you are a manufacturer and you see data like that, and this is now shown into a visual representation, which is showing the different countries in their minimum wage rates, where are you going to want to produce? If we ourselves here are one of the most expensive places to produce because the minimum wage rates are the highest, then you're going to be looking for the countries in this zone here to produce. And so unsurprisingly, you're going to see a connection here with goods being produced in China or India, Vietnam, Laos, Bangladesh, countries like that, which have much lower labour rates, and therefore that can be passed on to consumers in terms of lower costs for the products we buy from those regions. So that's one consideration a manufacturer may have to produce their goods overseas, lower labour costs. Okay, we can now see all this come together, all these considerations for Apple. So Apple has its HQ in California, over here. However, its overseas manufacturing for iPads and iPhones is in Shenzhen in China. Now, there are lots of reasons for that to occur. If we've already explored a few of them, we may have lower labour costs here in China compared to in America. And therefore, there'll be an advantage if you're producing your goods over there to do that more cheaply. Equally, however, you've got to consider a lot of raw materials coming in from different locations. And these could be these factors we've already considered. Where's the best place to source things? Well, some of these items, rare metals that are used in your iPhone and your iPads, comes from Mongolia in here, and also Bolivia down here. So we're going to be sourcing raw materials in terms of your metals and your minerals from these type of countries. The cobalt, which is really important for your battery, comes from the Congo. And so this is another location where you've got to bring in resources from. The semiconductors, which you use in terms of the phone, in terms of its processing, comes from Italy. So this is going to be shipped around and brought together. The memory processors come from South Korea. And the Wi-Fi Bluetooth connectivity comes from Japan. So why? Some of these countries have better skill sets that match those items. Some of them have better raw materials, which naturally occur in those countries. Some of them have labor rates to consider. Some of these countries have tariffs and production systems. So all of this comes together for manufacturing the iPhones and the Apple iPads. Afterwards, then, we then need to consider distributing this all around the world to all your consumers. So you can suddenly see here, there's a lot to take into account when making and using operations management processes for an item like an Apple iPhone or iPad. To see some more information about the making of the iPhone 13, please click on the link below and it takes you a whole video exploring it in more detail. So what are the benefits and limitations of using overseas manufacturing as a technique in operations management? Well, hopefully, as we've alluded to, can sometimes access cheaper labour rates, and that will then flow onto cheaper cost of production. In a country like China, where you have a huge pool of labour, you can draw upon that and skill sets that aren't available in your domestic country. It works really well with large volumes of simple assembly manufacture, where delivery times aren't too important because you're allowing yourself some time for the supply to be delivered via shipping, etc. And it allows you access to new export markets, as you're going to be able to get behind those tariff and quota wars we've been talking about. However, the disadvantage of doing overseas manufacture is, as I alluded to beforehand, in terms of our car manufacturing, that we now no longer have a car manufacturing industry in Australia because it can't be competitive with overseas. And therefore, we've lost jobs in domestic manufacturing in some of these industries. Once again, you're going to have to deal with language barriers, which make it tricky for some businesses to continue to operate overseas. And sometimes we have that association with countries having different standards to our own, where it may be sweatshop labour or corporate social responsibility conditions, environmental or legal standards being very different to what our consumers in the country are willing to accept, and what we believe is ethical and responsible in terms of operating businesses. So again, lots of things to consider this time in the era of overseas manufacture. Our next big topic here is global outsourcing. Now, this might be a term some of you may or may not be familiar with. So outsourcing is transferring specific business activities to an external business in an overseas country. If you want to think of it or break it down, okay, so we're sourcing some tasks or activities from outside our business, from outside our country. So we're getting other people to do it for us in certain areas. Now, you might have heard of some of these in relation to human resource management and payroll being done in countries other than Australia. It could be about IT or technology support, call centres. Some classic examples of the past might be you may associate a phone call from Telstra with call centres in India, so to speak. That service is being provided by a separate company outside of Australia and outside of Telstra. It's been done on their behalf. It could be in relation to operations or productions. So these are all completed by external businesses on your behalf. Outsourcing. Now, a good modern example we can talk about in relation to outsourcing is Telstra. Telstra have some of their customer services done overseas. In the past, it used to be India. More recently, one of the main countries is the Philippines. Now, you'll also have seen lots of recent advertising in relation to Telstra pulling back a lot of its customer services to within the country. That there's been some feedback that some Australian customers do not enjoy having that experience with overseas call centres and would prefer to have it done within our own country and protecting our own jobs. So this is one of those considerations that business needs to go through. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Now, this example here was about Teleperformance conducting work for Telstra as an outsourced business in the Philippines. And they were operating a range of customer support activities, inquiries, faults, and live chats. Following the implementation of government containment measures, so this is the whole COVID issue in 2020, which was restricting their workers from travelling a long way or from operating from home, it created a huge issue for this Teleperformance business. And they had to try and work out a way to keep their labour together. So they ended up organising short-term accommodation options for some of its workers on site for people who are willing and able to continue working these arrangements. And this is an example of a picture from the media of that Teleperformance industry working in the Philippines, where you see all the workers living on site in one of the levels so they can go to work, which was around the corner in that same office block. As a result of this, in this Mall of Asia office in Manila, the Telstra floor, which normally has a capacity for 200 people to work, had around 30 people accommodated and working on site. So you had the people working there as well as living there on site. So although this is outsourced business, this is Teleperformance, this isn't Telstra, Teleperformance is operating on behalf of Telstra in this capacity. And now you can imagine the flow on to you as a consumer in Australia. Are you happy to have this occur, which is absolutely legal within the Philippines, but does that meet your morals and your values and your beliefs as a customer for Telstra? So again, this is something that Telstra needs to consider when considering possibly doing outsourcing. So what are the benefits and weaknesses of outsourcing as a technique? Well, again, we're going to allude to the idea that we might get cheaper labour rates than Australia, and that's going to reduce our cost of production. Equally, we're not really responsible because it's not part of our parent company. We're getting someone else to do it for us. So this outsourcing means we're not responsible for these core services for employees and their wages and their entitlements. And that creates that disconnect. So we don't have to be concerned or worried about it. You're assuming it's part of the contract that's been done for you on their behalf. Now, it works really well in IT-based services. As we've alluded to again, the modern communication methods and our ability to source things from around the world via the internet greatly enhances our ability to have services based anywhere. And so overseas outsourcing becomes a real strength in this regard. So IT-based services, internet and phone developments mean that in theory, employees can be based anywhere in the world. And that can be a great advantage to us. However, once again, we need to consider these things. What's the limitations? Well, because it's no longer part of our business, we get reduced control over the activities of that business, and that reputation might flow back on us. Once again, we have to deal with language barriers, where we have overseas businesses, which might, as we talked about in relation to Telstra, lead to customer frustration, where you pick up the phone for a customer service inquiry and you're not getting what is deemed to be an Australian response to that. It's obviously hugely reliant on internet connections, and any breakdowns on those can break down your whole service. And we might be concerned that the social responsibility and legal standards in another country might be different to ours and may upset some of our customers' values or even our similar employees. And obviously, by moving and outsourcing and using external companies to do those jobs on our behalf, we may lose work in our own domestic country. So once again, lots of things to consider in the area of global outsourcing. Okay, so let's now apply our theory and our knowledge to a worked example here. So classic question, define global outsourcing, and we're going to use a contemporary business example. So we can see the split's going to be 1 mark for the definition and 1 mark for the example of this to get our full 2 marks. So here's a sample answer to reflect that. So outsourcing involves the contracting out of a business process, whether it be payroll processing, claims processing, or non-core functions like an IT or call center support to another business in another country in the world. So we're sourcing it from outside our business, outside our country. An example of this is Telstra, who outsource some of their customer support services to the business Teleperformance, which is based in the Philippines. So a good example, good definition, 2 together, and the full 2 marks. Well done. So as a summary slide, trying to put all of this together. So global considerations in the topic of operations management is considering everything from around the world and how it can affect our ability to produce goods and services. So there's lots of things to consider. We could think about the inputs coming in. So a good example in this regard was Cadbury bringing cocoa beans from Ghana. So we're considering where our inputs are coming. Is this the best country? Where's the best place for the climatic conditions? Where does that crop grow really well? What about the labor rates we need to consider? We need to consider the travel times, the shipping arrangements, how we protect the goods. We're concerned about tariffs and quotas and exchange rates changing. So lots of things in regards to the sourcing of inputs. Another consideration area could be manufacture. Making our products overseas to take advantage of better skills workers, better pools of worker, maybe cheaper labor rates overseas, maybe closer different export markets to try and overcome the restrictions of tariffs or quotas in some of those countries. So the ability to make our goods overseas. And thirdly, a consideration in regards to global outsourcing. So sourcing business activities from outside our business and outside our country. So commonly in the areas of human resources, IT, call center support, those type of examples where we're providing a service which could be based in any country. We're trying to take advantage of cheaper labor rates or bigger pools of well-skilled workers, or we're trying to focus on other core activities and outsourcing these other activities for businesses to control themselves. So lots of things to consider, and only just touching the surface of this massive area. Hope that was really of interest to you. But this is the area related to global considerations for operations management. What we're moving on to next is Unit 4, Area Study 1. So that concludes our Unit 3. I look forward to seeing you in Unit 4.